What if I told you that the moment someone becomes enlightened, it's said their voice can echo through mountain valleys? A skeletal green figure, moments away from being destroyed by supernatural demons, suddenly opens his mouth and sings words so powerful they transform terror into wisdom. This isn't background meditation music. This is the sound of a soul breaking free from the darkest karma imaginable. Today we witness the most intense spiritual breakthrough ever recorded, and discover why Milarepa's songs are still chanted in Tibetan monasteries 1,000 years later. Can poetry really become the path to enlightenment? Can a voice change an entire civilization? You're about to find out. Welcome back to Buddha's Wisdom. I'm Matt, and we're diving into the heart of the most impossible redemption story in Buddhist history. Last episode ended with the ultimate cliffhanger. Milarepa facing supernatural demons in what could be his final test. 3 years in what he called the Green Nettle Cave. A body turned the color of jade from eating nothing but stinging weeds. And now spiritual forces that could destroy him completely. Remember how we followed his path from mass murderer to broken hermit. 35 people killed with black magic. Then years of brutal training under Marpa the translator. Tower after tower built and demolished until his hands bled. Tonight determines whether someone who's committed mass murder can actually achieve complete enlightenment. Legends condense years of spiritual practice into this dramatic night of transformation. What you're about to witness created one of Tibet's greatest masters. A figure whose spontaneous songs would heal communities, inspire generations, and prove that no darkness is too deep for redemption. Over the next 25 minutes, you'll witness the exact moment darkness becomes light. You'll hear the first words of what would become known as the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa, and you'll understand why they called him the Singing Saint. But first, we need to see if he survives the night. The demons surrounded Milarepa like a supernatural storm, eyes blazing with accumulated fury. Claws extended like knives ready to tear apart this skeletal figure who dared face the weight of mass murder. His verses recall what happened next as completely unexpected. Instead of fighting or fleeing, Milarepa stood up from his meditation posture, looked directly at these manifestations of his worst karma, and spoke words that changed everything. "You are not my enemies," he said to the terrifying figures surrounding him. "You are my teachers." The demons paused, confused by this response. Tibetan elders still say that Milarepa then did something that defied every survival instinct. He opened his arms, as if welcoming beloved friends, and continued speaking to these supernatural forces. "You show me exactly what I've done. You carry the faces of people I killed. You embody the suffering I created." His voice grew stronger with each word. "For years I've tried to run from you through meditation, through cave retreats, through making my body green with nettles. But you've been waiting patiently to teach me the most important lesson of all." One account describes the lead demon, the one wearing the face of his uncle's wedding guests, stepping closer with claws raised. "And what lesson is that?" it demanded. Milarepa's response, preserved in the 100,000 songs, created the transformation that made him legendary. "That I am you, and you are me. There is no separation between the killer and the killed, between the sinner and the sin. Everything is one continuous flow of consciousness experiencing itself." The moment he spoke these words, his disciples later told something miraculous happened. The demons began to dissolve, not destroyed by force, but transformed by recognition. As Milarepa accepted complete responsibility for his actions without defending himself, without making excuses, the supernatural manifestations of his guilt began changing into something else entirely. Oral traditions tell us them becoming dakinis, wisdom beings who dance in the spaces between thoughts, teachers who appear in frightening forms to guide students toward enlightenment. And then, according to monasteries that still preserve this tale, something even more extraordinary occurred. Words began flowing from Milarepa's mouth, not planned speech, not memorized prayers, but spontaneous poetry that seemed to come from awakened consciousness itself. In his 100,000 songs, Milarepa actually recorded this pivotal moment. When you run after your thoughts, you are like a dog chasing a stick. Instead, be like a lion who turns to face the thrower of the stick. Legends imagine him singing lines like, "In the sky of mind, clouds gather and disperse, but the sky itself remains unchanged. In the ocean of consciousness, waves rise and fall, but the water itself is never disturbed." Tibetan valleys still echo with stories of his voice carrying impossible distances through the mountain passes, reaching Marpa's house miles away, waking sleeping villagers with words that seemed to heal something broken in their hearts. When dawn broke over the mountains, one song remembers that Marpa the translator appeared at the meditation site. He took one look at his transformed student and smiled for the first time in years. "The killer is dead," he reportedly said. "What remains is a master." Milarepa, no longer green and skeletal, but somehow radiant despite his physical condition, bowed to his teacher and sang another spontaneous verse. 3 years of caves and years of towers, all preparing for this single night. When the student finally disappears, the teacher's work is complete. Tibetan monasteries still chant this story of the moment Milarepa achieved what Buddhism calls rigpa, direct recognition of the awakened state that had always been present beneath the layers of guilt and suffering. But his transformation was about to become even more extraordinary, because when consciousness awakens completely, it cannot help but sing. His poetry describes what happened after his enlightenment as unlike anything in Buddhist history. Most realized masters teach through explanations, through guided meditation, through philosophical discussions. Milarepa's awakened consciousness expressed itself through spontaneous songs that seemed to heal whatever they touched. What made his songs different from ordinary poetry? Each verse emerged directly from the enlightened state, addressing the exact spiritual needs of whoever was listening, unlike written teachings that speak generally to all readers. Milarepa's songs seemed to know the specific pain each person carried. Villagers described incredible stories about the power of his voice. When he sang near a mountainside scarred by landslides, new vegetation began growing from damaged rock. When his songs echoed through valleys, even the wind seemed to pause and listen. But his voice carried something deeper than supernatural power. It carried the sound of a soul that had faced its worst karma, accepted it completely, and transformed it into compassion. Can you imagine what that sounds like? The voice of someone who's been to hell and back, who's carried the weight of 35 murders, and emerged not bitter, but overflowing with love? The ultimate test came when word reached the community still traumatized by memories of the supernatural storm that had killed 35 wedding guests years earlier. When residents recognized this transformed figure as the sorcerer who had caused their suffering, they were terrified. Some fled, others grabbed weapons. Children hid behind their parents. This skeletal, green-tinged figure looked like what villagers called a hungry ghost, a spirit of someone who had died with terrible karma and couldn't find peace. Instead of defending himself or making excuses, monasteries preserved the story of Milarepa sitting in the village center and beginning to sing about the nature of forgiveness. His voice, according to those who heard it, carried a quality that made anger impossible to maintain. Not because he was using some kind of supernatural charm, but because genuine remorse has a sound that hearts recognize instantly. One of his most famous verses, actually recorded in his 100,000 songs, captures this moment. All worldly pursuits have but one inevitable end, which is sorrow. Acquisitions end in dispersion, buildings in destruction, meetings in separation, births in death. Then legends imagine him singing directly about their shared pain. Hatred is a fire that burns the one who carries it. Forgiveness is water that extinguishes all flames. Villagers described weeping as they listened, not from sadness, but from a deep healing they couldn't explain. The sound of his voice, the obvious sincerity of his remorse, the genuine transformation they could see and feel, gradually melted years of accumulated grief and anger. By the end of his songs, the community that had feared him for years was asking for his teachings. Can you imagine that moment? The people whose relatives you murdered, asking you for spiritual guidance? The transformation had to be complete, authentic, undeniable. But the most extraordinary encounter was still coming. When Milarepa finally returned to visit his mother and sister, the reunion seemed impossible after everything that had happened. His mother, who had demanded he learn black magic for revenge, took one look at her transformed son and collapsed. She recognized immediately what her anger had created and what it had ultimately become. His verses recall her confessing her role in turning him into a killer, begging forgiveness for her part in the deaths of 35 innocent people. Milarepa's response, as preserved in his collected songs, demonstrates the complete transformation from vengeful sorcerer to enlightened master. Mother, your anger was my teacher. Your demand for revenge became my path to awakening. Without the deepest fall into darkness, I could never have found the brightest light. You gave birth to me twice, once as a human child, and once as a spiritual master. His sister Pita, who had watched him transform from beloved brother to mass murderer to enlightened yogi, finally found peace with the impossible journey they had all survived. She later told people that her brother's voice had changed completely. Where once it carried hatred and magical power, now it overflowed with a tenderness that could heal ancient wounds. This was the moment that marked Milarepa's true emergence as a spiritual master, not when he defeated demons, but when he healed the hearts of those he had harmed most. The songs were beginning to spread throughout Tibet, and they would change everything. Over the next several years, Tibetan valleys remember Milarepa, leaving Marpa's guidance to begin legendary wandering throughout the most remote regions of the plateau. The high passes were treacherous, where wind could freeze breath in your lungs, and thin air made every step a struggle. Winter storms could trap travelers for months in caves barely large enough for survival. Yet, in these impossible conditions, Milarepa thrived. Unlike conventional Buddhist teachers who established monasteries, Milarepa became known for appearing wherever suffering needed healing, often in places so isolated that finding him required genuine spiritual dedication. His teaching method was revolutionary. Rather than formal Dharma talks, he would assess each person's specific spiritual needs and sing spontaneous verses that addressed their exact situation. The silence of high mountain caves carried an otherworldly quality, when wind stopped howling and snow ceased falling. The stillness was so profound it seemed to press against your eardrums. In these moments of absolute quiet, his voice would emerge like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. One song remembers a wealthy merchant who climbed dangerous mountain passes searching for Milarepa. The merchant had everything material comfort could provide, but felt completely empty inside. When he finally found Milarepa meditating in a cave barely large enough for one person, frost coating the stone walls, breath visible in the frigid air, the merchant offered gold and jewels in exchange for teachings. For a long moment, only the sound of wind outside broke the cave's silence. Then Milarepa's voice filled the space. As preserved in his collected verses, we hear Milarepa responding with lines like, "You carry treasures up the mountain, seeking something you already possess. The wealth you seek cannot be bought, it can only be recognized. Look at this cave. Nothing here belongs to me, yet I lack nothing. What would you trade for a single song that could heal your emptiness?" One disciple's account says that the merchant left his material wealth in the cave, returned to his valley, and began living with a simplicity and contentment that amazed everyone who knew him. But not everyone was ready for Milarepa's radical message. When his growing reputation attracted attention from established religious authorities, they questioned whether this wandering cave dweller could really possess genuine spiritual attainments. A renowned scholar monk arranged a formal challenge, expecting to expose what he assumed was superficial realization. The scholar posed complex philosophical questions about emptiness and meditation stages. Milarepa's response was unexpected. He began singing verses that directly demonstrated the understanding being tested. "You ask about emptiness as if it were separate from form. But look at this monastery. Solid walls built from empty space." The scholar who had come to expose Milarepa as a fraud instead requested teachings from him. Perhaps the most significant challenge came from followers of Bon, Tibet's ancient pre-Buddhist tradition, who claimed his powers were simply continuation of black magic. Monasteries still chant Milarepa's response, demonstrating complete transformation from sorcerer to saint. Rather than displaying supernatural abilities, he invited his challengers to examine his motivation. Look into my heart and see what drives these seeming miracles. Is there any trace of anger, any desire for power? Or do you see only compassion, flowing naturally toward all suffering beings? His challengers became some of his most devoted students. This pattern defined his wandering years. The master who had once used supernatural power for revenge now used awakened abilities solely for healing and teaching. After years of wandering, Tibetan elders still say that Milarepa's reputation transcended religious boundaries and touched every level of society. Communities throughout the region began requesting visits from the singing yogi. His influence spread not through institutional authority, but through transformed lives that served as living testimonies to his teachings. Oral traditions recall villages where his brief visits left lasting changes. Communities divided by old feuds found reconciliation after hearing his verses about forgiveness. Regions plagued by natural disasters reported improved conditions after his presence. But what made his influence unique was its authenticity. Unlike religious authorities who demanded respect based on position, Milarepa's authority came entirely from the obvious genuineness of his transformation. People could see that this was someone who had genuinely walked the path from darkness to light. His scarred hands told the story of years building towers for Marpa. His lean frame and traces of green coloration preserved evidence of cave years sustained by nettles. His eyes carried the depth of someone who had faced the worst karma imaginable and emerged victorious. One song preserves accounts of hardened criminals abandoning violence after hearing his verses about karma. Wealthy merchants gave away fortunes after his songs revealed the emptiness of material accumulation. Scholars burned books and sought direct experience after his poetry showed them the limitations of intellectual understanding. These transformations happened spontaneously, not through lengthy instruction or formal ceremonies, but through immediate recognition of awakened consciousness expressing itself through song. His disciples told of a particularly moving encounter with a young woman who had lost her entire family to disease, leaving her consumed by anger at the apparent injustice of existence. The old songs recall Milarepa finding her preparing to throw herself from a cliff, choosing death over continuing to live with such pain. He didn't try to talk her out of suicide or offer philosophical explanations. Instead, he sang about his own journey from despair to awakening. I once stood where you stand now, believing death offered the only escape. But the darkness you're fleeing is the very soil from which enlightenment grows. She stepped back from the cliff and eventually found her own path to healing. This story echoes the deeper pattern we saw in his family reunion, showing how genuine transformation creates ripples of healing that touch everyone around it. The killer who became a saint, the destroyer who became a healer, the voice of hatred that became a song of compassion. As the oral tradition still preserved records, Milarepa actually wrote, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." Legends imagine him adding verses that capture his essential message. Your worst mistakes can become your greatest teachers. Your deepest darkness can birth your brightest light. Nothing is wasted. Everything serves the path. The singing saint had emerged from the depths of karma to prove that redemption is possible for anyone willing to face their actions completely, accept responsibility without excuses, and trust the transformative power of awakened consciousness. By this time, his voice was known throughout Tibet. Students were beginning to gather around him. The foundations were being laid for what would become one of Buddhism's most influential lineages, and his greatest adventures were still ahead. The wandering yogi was about to become something even more extraordinary. Can you imagine the courage required to face your worst mistakes, accept complete responsibility, and transform them into wisdom? That's the question Milarepa's story asks every one of us. What impossible transformation awaits on the other side of your deepest regrets? The singing saint who emerged from darkness to become Tibet's beloved master proves that no one is beyond redemption. No mistake is too great. No fall is too deep. If Milarepa's journey from killer to saint has moved you, if you believe transformation is possible even after the worst failures, then subscribe and stay with us. Because next week, we meet his most famous disciples, witness the establishment of the Kagyu lineage, and discover how a wandering yogi became one of history's most influential teachers. What songs would you sing if you achieved enlightenment? Leave a comment below. Sometimes the path to healing begins with admitting we need it. To be continued in Part 4, The Great Yogi,